Hello, and welcome to another chapter on animal behavior. Today, we're going to be talking about the evolution of behavior. You'll see here, this is a picture of a peppered moth, and we'll talk a little bit about how well they are camouflaged and how this kind of relates to natural selection and the theory of evolution. So first, let's review Tinbergen's four questions. The reason I bring them up is because they're really important as a foundation for studying animal behavior, and because you will be absolutely expected to know these questions and how to apply them in different real-world examples if you do anything related to animal behavior. And so definitely want to go over those, and I'll even give you some examples that you guys can practice. So first we have proximate mechanisms, and these are questions that answer how a behavior comes to be or how it happens. Mechanism questions explain how the behavior functions. For example, what's the physiology behind it? What are hormones or pheromones or brain circuits might be involved? Those are all the kinds of things that might happen with mechanism questions. The second type of questions are development questions, which ask how does the behavior develop within an individual? Uh, so from birth to adulthood, how does it change? And so proximate questions often cover, well, they do cover behavior within an animal's lifetime. And so let me go over them a little bit more in detail and give some examples. So the first questions are the mechanisms of behavior. So for example, we might ask, what causes the behavior to be performed? Or maybe what stimuli causes the subject to do what they're doing, or the animal to do what they're doing. I really want to put an emphasis on the word causes because usually if your question involves that word, it's most likely a mechanism question. Some common examples of mechanistic research might be like hormones or external stimuli. For example, maybe I want to ask, does increased testosterone cause increased aggression? Or maybe another question is, does physical touch cause the Venus flytrap to close its snap trap? So these would be examples of mechanism questions. The other kind of proximate questions are developmental questions. So these ask about how a behavior develops and changes throughout an animal's lifetime. This examines mostly can focus on sort of how they change through learning, through social learning, but also other forms of learning as well. Some examples of questions could be, how does play behavior develop throughout childhood? Or maybe how does courtship behavior develop in songbirds, right? So these would be examples of development questions. These questions are important, and you can ask a lot of comparative questions about development, and often one that's done a lot of in animal behavior research is play behavior. So those are examples of development questions. Today's lecture is going to mostly focus on ultimate questions, though, and ultimate questions pertain to evolution. The first type are function questions. I actually like to refer to these as adaptive value questions. And they ask, why does a behavior exist? What purpose does it serve? Why was this behavior adaptive for the animal? And then the evolutionary questions ask, how did this behavior or ability evolve? And when in the evolution of a species did such a phenomenon come to be? In contrast to proximate questions, ultimate questions work across generations. And so let me go a little bit more deeper into both of these kinds of questions for you. So for evolution or phylogeny questions, we can ask, how did this behavior or structure evolve? And when in evolution did such a phenomenon evolve? So anything that has to do with behaviors or traits being conserved across species is an example of an ultimate evolution question. For example, maybe we want to know how bird flight evolved from gliding dinosaurs, right? So we know that birds and dinosaurs were very closely related to birds. And so we might want to know how birds eventually got to be able to fly when dinosaurs could not. Another example, and I use this example here to show on this picture is, how do both vertebrates and cephalopods like octopi and squids evolve to have similar eyeball structure despite evolving a long, long time ago in an organism without that same structure? So that would be sort of an example of a phylogeny or an evolution question. And then, like we said, the fourth one, these are questions of adaptive value, right? They ask from an evolutionary perspective, why are these traits or behaviors the way that they are? What sort of advantage do they provide an organism? For example, we could ask, why do humans nurse their young? Maybe such a behavior increases the survivorship of offspring. If the behavior has adaptive value, we would expect it to provide some sort of advantage to the organism via increasing survival or reproduction. So I put this picture on here to highlight, maybe we want to ask, why do capuchin monkeys have long tails? Maybe it's to help them swing from trees. Maybe it is to help them escape predators. Maybe it is to help them catch prey. We don't know the answer to that, but we could ask that question from an adaptive value perspective and then try to get an answer to that question. So now we're going to go over a couple examples. I will read the example and then I will give you a pause for a couple seconds to let you try to think about what the answer would be. And this is really good practice and sort of a way of quizzing yourself throughout the lecture. So we'll go ahead and go over those examples. So is this a proximate or ultimate question? And if you really want to challenge yourself, which of the two kinds or which of the four kinds of questions do these most likely fall under? So a young chimpanzee female spends time watching her mother hunt for termites. Then when she grows up, she learns to fish the termites out of the nest too. What kind of questions would we be asking about this scenario here? I'll give you just a couple seconds to think about it. If you want some more time, go ahead and pause the video. Awesome. Yeah, so these would be approximate question. Specifically, it would be a development question, looking at how does a behavior develop within an individual over time, specifically looking, and in this example, specifically looking at learning. All right, next example. Viceroy butterflies evolved to look like monarch butterflies, which are poisonous and often avoided by birds. After an experiment, a researcher found that viceroy butterflies are less likely to be eaten by birds than other butterflies in the same area. Is the similarity in color explained by proximate or ultimate explanations? I'll give you guys a couple seconds here to think about this one. Great. If you said ultimate, then you would be correct. These would be an example of a function or an adaptive value question, answering why does, not necessarily a behavior in this case, but why does a structure or a color patterning exist in an animal? We know it exists in the viceroy butterfly, likely because it provides some sort of advantage. By mimicking a monarch butterfly, they are less likely to be eaten than the other butterflies in the area. All right. Is this a proximate or ultimate kind of research question? Dolphins' flippers have the same configuration of bones as other mammals, even though they are not used for walking. Guys, a couple seconds to think about that one. If you need some more time, pause the video. Great. If you said that this was an ultimate question, then you would be correct. Specifically, it is an evolution question or a phylogeny question because it's asking from what did this structure evolve, right? So it's trying to look at sort of the common ancestor between these bone structures and how we got to where we are. Now, I will give this as sort of a hint. Anything that has to do with a behavior, or in this case, a physical trait that's being conserved across species is often an ultimate evolution question. So you can kind of use that as a little bit of a shortcut there if you want to know that. Yeah, once again, just highlighting anything that's to do with structures conserved across species are examples of phylogeny or evolution questions. All right, here's another example. Male frogs call at night because doing so increases their chances of attracting mates and passing on their genes. Is this a proximate or an ultimate question? This is an example of an ultimate question. It has to do with the adaptive value of the behavior. It's adaptive for frogs to call at night because it increases their reproductive success. Therefore, this is an ultimate question or an ultimate explanation, specifically having to do with adaptive value or the function of a behavior. Here's another example. Sea turtle hatchlings move toward the ocean because they are instinctively drawn to the brightest horizon, which is usually over the sea when the moon is up in the sky. So is this an example of a proximate or ultimate explanation? This is the example of a proximate mechanism. Specifically, it's a mechanism or a causation, right? Why did this behavior evolve? Why did this behavior come to be? How did this behavior come to be, right? What causes it to be performed? Or in this case, what stimuli causes the subject to do what they are doing? And in this case, we're talking about the moon stimuli, right? So sea turtle hatchlings move toward the ocean because they're drawn to the brightest horizon, which is usually over the sea. Now, what's interesting, though, is watch how I can slightly change the wording and we can slightly change what we're discussing. Sea turtle hatchlings move toward the ocean because the moon alignment illuminates the ocean. Notice that the beginning of this is the same. Therefore, hatchlings are more likely to survive if they go toward the brightest horizon into the ocean. Notice how that slight change changes this from a proximate to an ultimate question. This is a function or adaptive value question, right? It's going from the stimulus that caused it, which is right looking at specifically the moon, right? So they're drawn to the brightest horizon, which is the moon. This is a proximate mechanism question. Whereas this one, by slightly changing it to say that the hatchlings are more likely to survive if they go to the brightest horizon, is going towards an ultimate sort of adaptive value question. And so this slight change of perspective can really shift in. So it's really easy to kind of get mixed up with this kind of stuff. So that's why I wanted to highlight sort of this example here. We'll get more practice throughout the course on these kinds of questions, but if you do want some extra question, I have 6 examples here that feel free to screenshot these and practice whether you think these are approximate or ultimate, and specifically which kind of questions. Are they adaptive value questions? Are they phylogeny questions? Are they developmental questions? Or are they a mechanism question? So you can kind of use these examples as practice. Go ahead and take a screenshot, and we're going to go ahead and move on to talk more about sort of the theory of evolution. Okay, now that we've had some practice, let's move forward to evolution, which is sort of the big foundation for studying animal behavior. Evolution is the gradual change of traits across generations as a result of natural selection. Natural selection is the process by which individuals with traits that help them to survive and reproduce will leave more offspring so that those traits can become more common in a population over generations and generations. That is why evolution occurs. If something is beneficial or increases survivalship or reproduction, then it's likely to be passed on. If you do this over millions and millions of years, then evolution occurs. Now, a lot of focus on evolution is on physical traits, but behavior can be shaped by evolution too. Behavior is just simply a trait. It can be determined by genes, learning, or one's environment. Behaviors that increase survival and reproduction will be more prevalent in a population, allowing them to be selected for. And so here are some examples, right? Birds singing can attract mates. Meerkats giving alarm calls can increase the survivorship of the other individuals in the group. Penguins will huddle together for warmth, increasing their ability to survive. So these are all examples of behaviors that have been selected for over time through evolution. And so just remember, a behavior is simply a trait. And the way that it comes about is it can vary with the behavior, but it is a trait that can be selected for. Now, Charles Darwin is known as the father of evolution. And so he was the original person who kind of proposed the idea of natural selection and evolution. In his 20s, he joined a 5-year voyage on the ship, the HMS Beagle. During his travels, especially to the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that animals of the same kind looked and behaved a little bit differently depending upon where they lived. For example, there were finches that had beak shapes depending on the type of food that they ate. These are now known as the Darwin finches, and they're quite a famous study because they were sort of thought to be the inspiration for Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. From these observations, Darwin proposed that species are not fixed, but that they can change over time. He introduced the idea of natural selection, the process by which organisms with traits that help them to survive and reproduce are more likely to pass those traits on. In 1859, he published his famous book on the origin of species, which completely changed the way that we understand life on Earth today. Darwin's ideas are still the foundation for modern biology, and they help us to explain not just physical traits, but also behavior too. Now, today we're going to focus on one primary mechanism for evolution, and that is natural selection. The phrase survival of the fittest refers to this process of natural selection. So for now, that's what we're going to look at, and we'll get into the other 4 in the next lesson. But just know that natural selection is not the only mechanism by which evolution can occur. Other mechanisms do indeed exist. We're just going to focus mostly on this one today. So there are 2 types of selection, natural selection and artificial selection. Both work by allowing individuals with certain traits to reproduce and thus pass their traits on to offspring, which ultimately can shape a species over a long period of time. But what drives each process differs. Natural selection is driven by the environment. Traits that lead to the highest reproductive success increase over time. So natural selection actually modifies the population. The fittest survive and reproduce, passing on those traits that help them survive. Those individuals that are unfit for the environment will then die out, and those traits die out with them. So populations diverge into new species. We will go over sort of this peppered moth example that I brought about in the beginning title slide here in a second. But this is sort of an example of how natural selection worked in the real world and is a very, very interesting and famous case study for it. Now let's compare natural selection to artificial selection. In this case, humans are the ones choosing which traits they want to see in animals or plants. Instead of the environment deciding, we do. Now, a great example of this is dog breeds. In every generation, we sort through the organisms that we have, choose those that meet our criteria, and then allow them to have the chance to mate. While at the same time, we then deny breeding opportunities to the organisms that fail to meet our criteria. Right, so breeding dogs, there are certain breed standards, and so breeders will choose to let dogs that best meet their criteria to continue reproducing and passing on their desired characteristics. And so this was done purposely to choose specific characteristics for certain dogs. So both natural selection and artificial selection can change traits over generations. The difference is who or what is doing the selecting. In a natural selection, it's the environment, and in artificial selection, it is human beings. So let's go over sort of the peppered moth example. In the early 1800s in London, there were these moths that were called peppered moths. They're sort of pictured here. They have this sort of look of this salt and pepper kind of look to them. And this pattern helped the moths survive because it helped them to camouflage against lichens that were growing on the tree bark. Unfortunately, then something changed within their environment. During the Industrial Revolution, with all of the coal-powered factories and the trees, basically the trees and the bushes all became really, really dark in color, and they were no longer white. Now, this was a problem for the white moths because now they stick out like a sore thumb. At the start of the Industrial Revolution, only 2% of peppered moths were darker. And you can kind of see what they look like here. So when the trees and the brush became very, very dark, well, what happened? All of the white moths begin to be eaten by the birds, and so they were not surviving long enough to be able to mate, whereas the darker colored moths were thriving, passing on their genes containing a different colored pigmentation. And so over time, the darker moths, as you can see here, are much harder to see. The darker moths are camouflaging and surviving, having more and more offspring than those moths that are white. And so by 1985, about 95% of peppered moths were this darker pigmentation due solely to sort of the change in environment. So this is natural selection. And it is the most powerful mechanism that evolution has within its toolkit to be able to act on change. And so this is a physical characteristic, but once again, the same can also apply to behavior. Now, the theory of natural selection and the theory of evolution are not the only types of mechanisms that were being proposed at the time. There was another scientist named Jean Baptiste Lamarck who believed that an organism could actually pass on characteristics that it acquired during its lifetime to its offspring. Now, he called this the law of inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now, this is actually a very common misconception even today. This is not how evolution works. For example, people will sometimes believe that giraffes once had really, really short necks, similar to that of like a zebra or maybe a horse. But those short-necked giraffes would then stretch their necks in order to reach the leaves high up in the trees and then eat those leaves because nobody else was being able to eat those leaves, but the giraffes, because they stretched their necks, now they were doing it. And so they continued to stretch their necks until they became longer and longer and then had offspring that had slightly longer necks. Those babies then stretched their necks more and more, and then so on and so forth over thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. All of a sudden, giraffes have very, very long necks. Now, this was a theory that came about around the same time as Darwin's theory of evolution, but it is completely incorrect. This is not how evolution works at all. Traits that are acquired during one's life do not get passed on to offspring in this way. Most of our parents, for example, have had their wisdom teeth removed, but when we are born, we still have those pesky teeth and need them to be removed as well, right? So that is not exactly what happens. If Lamarck was correct, then maybe over time we would stop as a species having wisdom teeth because how many people are getting them removed. But that is not how that works. And so Darwin's idea challenged this theory by instead viewing natural selection in a different way. Now, what Darwin would say is that originally, yes, giraffes did have shorter necks. However, within a population of individuals, there were some that had slightly longer necks, and they could reach trees that other short-necked animals could not. And whether that was through mutation or some other variation, we don't know, but it's most likely, probably just through variation, just like we as humans have people of different heights, right? Giraffes probably had some individuals with different neck lengths, right? And so then over time, those that could eat the leaves that were inaccessible to the other species would survive more and be able to produce more offspring. And then so over time, the longer neck genes are passed on, and you will see sort of overall sort of a general increase in neck length over many, many, many generations. And so that is sort of how Darwin's theory, Darwin's view kind of contrasted Lamarck's view. And we know today that Darwin's view is the correct view and Lamarck's is incorrect. So that is really important to keep in mind. But I do want you to sort of just be aware that this was not the only theory, that there were other examples or other points of view that were coming about how animals evolved and how they became to be. It was not just Darwin. And so, yeah, I just wanted to highlight that as one of them. That is still even a misconception today. People will say, well, they evolved this because, it was beneficial and they made this change in their lifetime and then they passed that on. And we as organisms don't get to choose what we pass on trait-wise. And we certainly don't get to pass on through genes any sort of acquired characteristics throughout our lives. All right, so back to natural selection. How does evolution work? I'm going to kind of go through sort of the step-by-step process of how it would work. because this is a really important hint, really important thing that you need to be able to know. So first, a critical piece of natural selection is that there has to be variation to begin with. Some individuals in the population must have variation in their genes, just like the black-colored peppered moths. They already had a darker pigmentation. They were just really rare because they were a lot easier to see against the white background. Similar with the giraffes, right? There had to be variation in neck size for evolution to sort of act upon it. Then step 2, the environment selects those variations that give an advantage to individuals with that variation. Again, with the Industrial Revolution and the peppered moths, there were coal-powered factories covering the environment in soot, making the dark pigmentation advantageous for that environment. Individuals that, and then step 3, so individuals that now have the advantageous variation will survive and reproduce more than those that do not have that trait, which then moves us on to step 4. The offspring of those that survive better will inherit those advantageous characteristics. Step 5, the new generation is then better adapted to their environment. And lastly, the group overall will become sort of better adapted. And then this is kind of step 6, which is over time, over generations and generations, you get a sort of this runaway on this trait that results in evolution. And so in the course of less than 100 years, we went from moths that were mostly white with black spots to mostly black in color, right? And so that's an example of evolution happening over time, happening over generations. Here's sort of another example of this sort of step-by-step process. I'll kind of go ahead and read it. So you start out with different kinds of beetles. You got green beetles and you got brown beetles. Then something in its environment is going to exert some sort of pressure on the beetles that is going to give variation or differences in reproduction or survival. So in this case, it looks like the bird that gets put into the environment prefers to eat green beetles. Now, the surviving brown beetles then have more baby brown beetles, which then cause this sort of runaway selection of having more and more brown beetles in the population. And the end result is that we get an advantageous trait of brown coloration, which allows the beetle to have more offspring, become more common in the population. And then if it continues for a very, very long time, you can get sort of a runaway selection where all of the beetles are now brown. And so this is a very just basic example that illustrates how a characteristic can evolve throughout time. So you need variation, you need sort of differential reproductive success, then you need to have some sort of heritability, and then sort of can result in an end result of what we may see today in a species. So that's what we're going to go over now. We're going to go over the 3 essentials for evolution. There are 3. You need variation, you need fitness differences, and you need inheritance. And so we're going to kind of dive into each one of these to wrap up this lesson. The first one, just so you have some terminology, the phenotype, you do need to know these 2 terms. So a phenotype is the physical observable traits. And so I use the example of eye color, right? So the phenotype of eye color is the color of your eyes. Some people have green eyes, some people have brown eyes, some people have gray eyes, some people have blue eyes, right? Those are humans' phenotype. However, the genotype is the DNA or the genetic makeup that causes the phenotype to exist. And so phenotype are physical, right? So pheno starts with PH, phenotype, physical. Genotype, genes, right? So the gene, the genetic material that results in the phenotype. So for natural selection to act, there must be variation for a specific trait within a population. And so we need to see some sort of variation caused in order for natural selection to act. If all beetles are green in a population, there's no variation for natural selection to act upon. So variation can be caused by a number of different factors. They can be either environmental or genetic. Some environmental factors might include migration, where sort of genetic diversity is increased by new variants coming in and out of a population. And some genetic factors might be examples of mutation or genetic recombination. This is where sort of chromosomes cross over and swap positions of sections with other chromosomes, that you can get sort of things like this tulip down here in the bottom right, where this is a red sort of tulip, but maybe randomly there's a tulip that all of a sudden develops yellow petals. Now, whether that yellow petal coloration is advantageous will sort of be dependent upon the environment, but it could be advantageous, and in which case, over generations, you might see these flowers become more and more yellow, or maybe even orange, right? And so that's sort of an example of how variation can be introduced into a species. The second key feature is that this variability needs to sort of result in different reproductive success. Or put maybe another way, the trait must change the fitness of the organism that has it. If the variation that we're getting doesn't actually result in any advantage, then it will either not exist in the first place, not continue to exist, right? In the case of like a rare mutation, right? If a rare mutation happens and there's no fitness benefit, it's not going to then sort of be passed on and become prevalent within an organism. This sort of example was very obvious in the peppered moths, right? So there was an advantage. There were dark moths and there were light moths, but the dark moths all of a sudden got a very, very distinct advantage, which allowed them to have a fitness difference, which allowed evolution to sort of act upon that species as an organism. And then lastly, there has to be a way for these traits to be passed down to offspring. Traits are carried in an organism's genes. That's why I wanted to go over the term genotype with you, which are then copied and passed on to the next generation. If a trait cannot be inherited, then natural selection cannot act upon it. So you might be thinking then, what about behavior? We know that behavior is not always genetically inherited. I will say there are instances where it is genetically pre-programmed, but we will kind of get into those examples later on throughout this course. But natural selection, so by that logic, you would say, well, how in the world can behavior evolve then? How can behavior be selected for if it is not inherited? Well, the thing is this: natural selection does not only act on DNA, it can also act on other things. And so how might a behavior be reliably passed on if it isn't not genetically based? One option is through social learning. So if adults learn behaviors that are beneficial, then when they have offspring who learn those behaviors from observing them, then the behavior can persist. It is therefore inherited from parent to offspring. So for example, I like this picture here, which shows a young chimpanzee learning to fish out termites out of a termite mound by watching its parents do the exact same thing. And so then she is more likely to engage in that behavior when she gets older, which provides her a benefit. Then when she has children, they will be able to watch her do the same thing. And so this is getting inherited through social learning. Now, not all species are capable of social learning, though, or not all. We don't always have evidence that they are, at the very least. And so there are other ways that it can happen as well. So for another one, parents can influence offspring through behaviors, through early experience or chemical signals, sometimes even modifying their gene expression without actually changing the DNA sequence. And so this is another way that certain kinds of traits can be passed on or inherited. For example, in some birds, the way that a mother feeds and trains her chicks will sort of affect their later survival skills. And so if the mother's behavior is benefiting their chicks, then when they grow up, those chicks may be then more likely to engage in that behavior to help their chicks survive, and so on and so forth. Another example is that even if behavior itself is encoded into DNA, an animal may inherit a tendency or a capacity to learn behavior more easily. For example, birds that sing songs may inherit the neural structures needed to learn a song, so that natural selection can then favor those who can acquire that beneficial behavior, right? So you and I may not have the same structures of a bird in our brain to learn how to replicate birdsong, but birds do, through their DNA and through their genetics, inherit these natural structures that they then allow them to more easily and readily learn birdsong, which they can then learn and then apply throughout their lives, that bird song is then advantageous. So those birds that have those structures that are optimized will then pass on those structures to their offspring, or those optimized structures to their offspring. So that's how 3 examples of how behavior can be quote unquote inherited, even if genes are not directly involved. And so the inheritance doesn't always have to be DNA. What matters is that successful behaviors are reliably passed on, whether that's via teaching, imitation, or maybe a genetic predisposition for learning. This allows natural selection to then shape behavior over generations. And so just to revisit, these are the 3 essential, I don't know why they're all labeled number 1, but these are the 3 essentials for evolution. There needs to be variation, which means a trait must vary within a population. There need to be fitness differences. Traits must result in differences in survival or reproduction. And there must be some level of inheritance. Traits need to be passed on in order for them to, in order for evolution and natural selection to act upon them. And so that is the end of this lesson. Here is sort of an overview of the things that we discussed today, specifically highlighting in red the inheritance of acquired characteristics, because this is, once again, not how evolution works. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I hope that was helpful.